In a surprise move, with what we thought was going to come a bit later on, maybe a few weeks from now, we actually got the announcement that the beta of The War Within is actually coming out in just 5 days. Now, besides the usual abuse of hopium whenever this is announced for the beta invites that Blizzard will throw out, of course, this expansion is different because to everyone who has already pre-purchased the Deluxe Special Mega Epic Extra Edition, you also have the access to the beta, which means many more players now will get access to being able to test the beta from the get-go. It looks already also a pretty advanced beta compared to the other usual betas we have gotten previously, since all of the zones, all of the dungeons, the delves, the warband system, as well as the full leveling experience will already be fully working in the beta release in just a few days. So what we have to point out after this announcement of the release of the beta coming very soon is of course the most recent alpha changes. Because, you know, from what was a series of changes you would have forgotten in a few days because you don't really get to test them yourself, you don't really get to look at them in game yourself, so it's not, you know, very relevant to you. Now though, to everyone who has the Epic Edition of The War Within, all of these alpha changes you will actually get to test in-game very soon in the beta in a few days. So going over the most relevant changes of this last round of the alpha, let's start by the first sweeping change Blizzard gave, which was to make the raid cooldowns of most of the healing specs to be stronger outside of the raid. So that's the general explanation Blizzard gave. So you have, you know, Luminous Barrier of the Discipline Priest being 400% stronger on 5 targets. You have Divine Hymn of a Holy Priest being 400% stronger. You have Revival of a Mistweaver Monk. You also have Dreamflight of the Preservation Evoker, Tranquility of a Resto Druid, Healing Tide Totem of a Resto Shaman. All these raid cooldowns are now getting much stronger in basically Mythic Plus, right? That's the point of this change, to now make these cooldowns quite good in Mythic Plus as well. Excluding this, we can also start skipping the more minor of the changes, you know, stuff that it's hard to quantify early on, like for example a bunch of moving of talents around, like for Affliction, or even just basic number changing, like Blizzard realizing that the Rider of the Apocalypse hero talent for DK did no damage, so they basically just doubled the damage of most of the effects on that 3. Talking about the more interesting changes, you have a whole bunch of new talents given to Affliction. Now this is a bit of a bait, because you see Improved Haunt, Malign Omen, Malefic Touch, and especially Infirmity. You start thinking perhaps some positive news are coming the way of Affliction. The answer is no. The answer is you're still playing heavily around Malefic Rapture in the next expansion. I'm sorry, there is no escaping that ability in the next expansion for Affliction as well. A couple of positive buffs going along the way for Arcane. Now Arcane Surge is guaranteed all the times to give you clear casting, as well as Arcane Blast also having a 5% increased chance to generate clear casting. This is overall making the gameplay more smooth for Arcane, giving them more overall clear casting options, especially doing their cooldowns. Talking about the power of cooldowns being buffed outside of the raid, there is a major cooldown being nerfed actually, because Rapture now increases the absorption of your next 3 power word shields by 80%, instead of increasing all of your power word shields in the next 8 seconds by 40%. Rapture was one of the ways in which Discipline Priests would be ramping for their big HPS cooldowns, the other one being Evangelism. Now if you want to replicate what you were doing with Rapture, you will just have to flat out use like 5 or 6 more renews instead. Although it is true, it takes away one extra bit of complexity from the spec, which might not be enjoyed by some players who liked the idea of Discipline being the the rocket science spec of healers when it came to the raid. This is easing up a bit the complexity level of the ramps of a Discipline Priest. There are also some cool and interesting changes coming the way of Blood Decay, amongst a few additions to talents and some interesting additions to others. For example, Blood Drinker now giving you quite significant damage reduction while you actually use it, as well as Tightening Grasp now becoming a pseudo scuffed version of a Sigil of Silence, because now pulling enemies towards you with Gorsefin Grasp also silences enemies for 3 seconds if you talent Tightening Grasp, which is, it's good mythic plus utility for a Blood Decay. And also the interesting change of making Bone Storm no longer be based on costing runic power, but instead be based on costing Bone Shields and then giving you back 1 Bone Shield charge every second while you are using Bone Storm. Who instead gets the prize for having the more new additions in this round of the alpha is Unholy, because Unholy gets 2 very interesting additions to talents. One is quite easy, almost free to take, which is Festering Sight, because it's very early on in your talent tree pathing, and it's also likely the more interesting one. Every 20 Festering Wounds you are bursting, you turn Festering Strike into Festering Scythe for 12 seconds, and Festering Sight sweeps through all enemies within 14 yards in front of you, dealing shadow damage and infecting them with 2 to 3 Festering Wounds, which can then be burst to then continue to turn Festering Strike into Festering Sight. Basically, in AoE situations, you will always have Festering Sight active as an Unholy Decay, which makes for much more consistent AoE damage. The other talent, instead, is lower down in your talent tree, so it's much more costly to actually spend 2 points to get the composition. Virulent Plague has a chance to abruptly flare up, dealing 100% of the damage dealt on the target over the last 4 seconds, and when this effect triggers, you can extend the duration of your minions by up to 3 seconds. In both cases, both of these talents are for more consistent AoE damage. They're not really necessarily single target focused in terms of damage for Unholy Death Knight. Initially a pretty cool, but technically a pretty meme addition to Augmentation, now you have a weak aura as part of your passives, because now when you enable Sense Power, allies with their major cooldown active will be highlighted in the game field and in the raid frames. This, as I said, it's a weak aura, and it's even a bad one, because as an Augmentation Evoker you kind of want to have a 15 to 20 second basically warning, basically preemptive idea of who is about to use their cooldowns so that you can buff them preemptively. So this thing is cool for casual play and for players just, attempting Augmentation casually or for the first time, but later on, if you want to min-max your play as an Augmentation Evoker, you will have to do a little bit more than this default passive ability. What we knew was going to happen continues to happen for the Chrono Warden hero talent of Evoker. Time Convergence has been now giga nerfed time and time again. Initially, this was any ability with a 45-second or longer cooldown was going to give you 10% intellect, and then the defensive abilities were giving you 10% stamina. Then Blizzard nerfed it to only be 5% intellect and 5% stamina, and then they nerfed it even more by completely reducing the stamina altogether and only giving you intellect instead. Yes, we knew this was going to happen, no real surprise here. There has been a change, this one in response to community feedback. This was to Fire Mages complaining about the addition of Charring Embers to Phoenix Flames. Charring Embers was the passive which applied Charring Embers to all enemies, increasing the damage taken by you by 5%. Blizzard is removing this due to the feedback of Fire Mage players complaining about the another extra things you now have to track and you now have to manage in your rotation as a Fire Mage to keep up as a debuff on the enemies. So now this is being essentially reverted. This addition is being reverted for Fire Mages. We continue down the nightmare that is Blizzard attempting to balance 2 ways, 2 lifestyles of Holy Paladin. the caster version and the melee version. We do have some substantial buffs to the melee version. Avenging Crusader is now free, no longer costs holy power, that's great. It grants an additional charge of Crusader Strike, that's also great, and also it lasts for 3 seconds more, that's also great. On top of this, Crusader's Might doesn't just reduce the cooldown of your Crusader Strike, but also of Judgment. So, quite some beefy buffs to the melee version of Holy Paladin. At the same time, also buffs to the caster version by having Holy Light cast time being reduced, by having Infusion of Light now buffing the heal power of Holy Light instead of giving you Holy Power, and Inflorescence of the Sunwell now giving you more healing from Infusion of Lights for Holy Light rather than giving you more Holy Power. This is also good because generally speaking, Paladin would end up starting to get quite flooded with Holy Power, which is also made worse by how weak their spenders of Holy Power actually are. So it's better to reduce the flow of Holy Power in exchange for actually making your abilities stronger for Holy Paladin. Yes, technically none of the spenders are actually being buffed here, but it's still a move in the right direction for Holy Paladin. Another pretty positive change for Mistweaver Monk, this one perhaps not at the high end, but to give you some more, passive, not nearly as complex playstyle by giving you a talent node choice with Chi Harmony, the buff you have to manage for the 50% heal increase, etc, etc. Now instead you have a pretty laid back passive talent called Lotus Infusion, allies with Renewing Mist receiving more healing from you, and Renewing Mist duration is increased by 2 seconds. So, very passive, very default, but doesn't require nearly as much min-maxing and as much management as Chi Harmony does. And lastly, we have perhaps the bigger of the nerfs at the end for a hero talent, this time for Priest, again, on top of the changes to Rapture for Discipline. This one is for Oracle, the already reworked, the previously horrible hero talent about Power Infusion. Now, though, it gets further nerfed, because the reworked idea of Oracle is that you had the choice to pick one of these 3 buffs every minute. This was terrible already, because Premonition of Piety is far stronger than the other 2. It's also stronger than the other 2 combined. It's also stronger if you combined the other 2 and doubled the effects of the other 2. Premonition of Piety was still stronger. So what did Blizzard do? Did they buff the other 2? No, they did not. They in fact made it even worse by now, as you can see from the tooltip, Premonition rotates to the next spell when cast. So, instead of buffing the other 2 so that you would not choose to cast Piety every single time, now instead they force you to rotate to the other 2 terrible premonitions before you can get to Piety again. Now, the rest of the 3 has been buffed, that's true. You have gotten even more movement speed from Angelic Feather, you have gotten even more defensiveness from Desperate Prayer, and making Angelic Bulwark now actually pretty good, giving you a 30% max HP Absorb Shield. They gave you the option not to make Premonition 30% stronger, but to reduce the cooldown of Premonition by 15 seconds, and more importantly, to give you a second charge of Premonition. So if you want, you can have 2 charges on a 45-second cooldown, but in the end, that is still far weaker, because the older version, you could use Piety every minute, even if you had 1 charge, it's just 1 Piety buff every minute. With this new version, even with a 45-second cooldown and even with 2 charges, because you are forced to cycle through them, Piety will still end up having basically a 90-second cooldown at best, which is a nerf, because the other 2 buffs are quite weak. But the biggest insult out of it all is that the last talent, the capstone, which is supposed to be the shining light of all of this, is an insult, because this reads, after casting Solace, your next premonition gives you all the other effects at once. There is a problem though. What comes after Solace is Piety, which is what you already wanted to cast in the first place. So, getting the other 2 for free after you cast Solace means you're casting Piety and getting the other 2 for free. except you don't care about getting the other two for free. You would have much rather wanted to cast Insight and get Piety for free, or being able to cast Solace and get Piety for free. Instead, with the rotation always being Piety into Insight into Solace, this awful talent means that you cast Solace, your next premonition is buffed, but you don't care because you're getting Insight and Solace for free, which right now are very weak. It's nowhere near the power of Piety, which is literally a legendary. That's how good it is. To be able to splash 50% of your overhealing for 10 seconds, it's a massive power. So this rework, this change to this hero talent is definitely nerfing the power level of this premonition buff. However, after this, these were all of the major changes overall in this latest round of tuning. There are, of course, as mentioned, a few others, mostly around, giving you some more things learned passively or moving around in your talent tree or costing one less talent point here and there, etc., etc. But talking about the more important changes overall, these were the ones that happened in the latest round of the alpha tuning, which, as mentioned, we thought, and by we I mean the collective high mind writing these videos, that it was going to be worth pointing out, since in just a few days many players will have access to the beta and therefore they will have access to be able to test all of these changes happening right now in the alpha. So, for today, this recap from the alpha after the announcement of the beta of the War Within coming live on this Friday, we can now leave each other. We are starting, as usual, the goodbyes by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can, as usual, still be given for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, oh my god, today is so bad. I slept like 3 hours, 12 hours ago. I am tired, but I cannot sleep.